Hey, a few people asked me on the this Discord like how I got this sort of filmic look for these images, and I said I'd do a screen recording just to sort of give you an idea. And I sort of can't remember how I did it, so I'll kind of make it up as I go along. But this is the sort of photo that ended up with. Um, so let's have a go from the original. Now it's good to say from the offset, like obviously I've got quite a lot of stuff in camera, so the sort of glows and things like that, they were because I was using a sort of mist filter that sort of glowed out the highlights. You can recreate that in post, but you kind of have to fake it, and you'd have to kind of either do that in Photoshop or do that separately. There's not really an easy way to get that exact look, and it also gives it that sort of grain pattern that looks quite nice. It's just shot with a fairly high ISO, so there's a fair amount of grain in it. But I wasn't too worried about getting something sharp because I knew that I wanted like a fairly cinematic look. So it was a fairly slow shutter speed. I can't remember where you see that on this metadata. Probably my library, isn't it? Shutter speed 1/80th, so not as far, not as slow as film, but not far off either, and probably much slower than I would probably use if I were going for something a bit more classically photographic, I suppose. But it was shot at night, relatively quick. I shot at 2.8 on a 50mm lens, and quite a nice lens as well. That I think that does make a difference. I tend to go for primes if I'm trying to do something cinematic. I think they give me the best result. But anyway, let's dive into some developing. So um, I would usually work with reference, although to be honest, I probably didn't on this one. I probably just sort of tweaked a bunch of stuff. But really, it's a case of trying to emulate what film or kind of a digital cinema sensor will give you, and that look that you get with film, which is far less detailed than photographs usually. I guess it depends on the film, but to be honest, I just play with values a bit. Like I know that things are going to be a little bit too dark, so up the contrast a bit. I'll probably at this point just check my white balance and get that in the range that I want it to be. There's going to be quite a lot of contrast. I'd probably tweak the histogram just so I'm sort of checking I'm not blowing things out too much. Um, but it's kind of okay. There's a lot of leeway with this kind of style. Like you can really sort of push things quite far, and it doesn't matter too much. So I usually make sort of a few adjustments in that whatever this panel is called, the basic panel, I suppose. Um, Not messing around with things too much to do with like localized contrast. Texture is probably going to be the main one that will give you that kind of crunchy film look. I would probably actually turn the clarity down, and maybe even the dehaze a little bit down to kind of flatten things out a little bit, which is kind of contrary to what you would sort of usually do. Same for saturation as well. You don't really need too much saturation for that sort of filmic look, or in fact, it helps not to have it. And we'll sort of put color back in later to certain elements of the image because obviously cinema and films are graded much more harshly than photos can be sometimes, I guess. So let us just pull up the shadows a little bit. Let's use the curves. I tend to like using the tone curve for this type of look a bit more because it's kind of what's the word? Almost holistic in its use. Like everything you do is going to adjust something else. Like it's not like these sliders where you're kind of specifically adjusting a range. Like unless you've chosen to put lots of key points in here, it's gonna affect everything quite significantly. Um, but in the first sort of big amount of like filmic look, and we'll add more later, will be kind of um, giving in that sort of cyan uh, and sort of orange look, or at least starting to. So we're going to pull the shadows down a little bit to make them more cyan, and then push back into there to give us this bit back. It's going to make them more red to begin with, but if we just sort of balance that out with some green, it'll give us a sort of bluey look. It's fair to say as well, I've actually switched monitors since I did those original ones, so I'm sorry if it doesn't look quite the same. And also, I haven't had time to calibrate this, but we'll get there. This is already looking pretty good. Um, I would say the shadows are probably way too high. So I'll probably pull down my exposure a little bit and actually sort of crush the black a bit more to give it that look. At this point, I'll probably jump over to the color panel. Like this is kind of where I would, if I were doing grading for movies or for video, I'd be relying on this to kind of pull areas of the scene together. So it's about kind of picking the kind of colors you want and then getting rid of others. So I can't even remember what I did in this one. Actually, I didn't mess around with it too much, but there's a lot more green than there is blue. So perhaps these bluer areas, we'll just pull those over to a sort of more cyany kind of color, and then this green will bring that up to match. Same with the yellow. Let's not mess around with that too much. Orange skin tones. Be careful with that, although it can make the image look quite kind of good. The skin tones will suffer. So I usually just, if you're going to mess with it, I would desaturate it a little bit just to offset what's happening with the skin tones. And again, with the red, I would usually push that a bit, but there's such this big red in the side. I don't really want to mess with that too much. There's, to be honest, purple and magenta don't come up much. Depends on the sensor you're using. You can see it's kind of messing with this here, but I find they don't. There's not usually a lot of purple or magenta in most scenes, so I usually sort of just desaturate those completely, just to sort of know that it's something I'm not going to have to deal with. So let's pull those down. So we're already getting there. It's kind of like quite a desaturated, contrasty look, I suppose. And what we'll do here, the part of the cinematic look, I guess, is this crop. So that's probably a good idea to put that in. It's just 21 by 9. That's kind of a fairly standard anamorphic look. If you don't have it, you can just type it in or enter custom, and then you can just type in 21 by 9, and that's a fairly good crop. So let's do that. Actually, that one was a bit higher, but that's okay. It's actually brighter than I had before. But we're being creative, so it can be whatever we want it to be. But I would probably bring those highlights down a little bit, and then bring up down the shadows, and maybe bring the whites up just to stretch that out a bit. But it's looking pretty good. It's a good start anyway. It depends on like your thoughts about this, but I actually do use like the tint and white balance to give it a look in the grade as well. Like they're quite powerful tools, and I think it's a mistake to just sort of see them as like a correction tool. Like you can do quite a lot in there. But one of the real powers that we're going to have is this color grading tool, which is a recent addition. I guess it's been in there for a couple of years, but that's quite recent to me with Lightroom. We can get extreme with it. We can sort of play around and see what feels right, and then dial it back. So what I tend to do is I use this little, I just drag it out like to where I sort of feel is the right sort of mood or color, or makes it feel good. And then I hold Shift, and then it'll only kind of do the intensity of that. So we'll never be at extremes, or we'll barely be touching it, to be honest. Mid-tones, I'd probably push them up to, get them looking a bit warmer. And then highlights a little bit, I would probably just make them even very similar to the mid-tones, to be honest, maybe a little bit more orange, and bring that back as well. And then you've got these sliders as well. These are like kind of luminance, I guess, of each of those things. So you can kind of see that it's adjusting everything overall. And do mess with those. Like they can give you quite a different look. And if you leave things default, you're sort of missing out on sort of half of the story, I think. So yeah, it's always worth just seeing what you're getting with that. And I like to be fairly kind of no like one value is going to work. So it's just a case of dragging things around and making them look, or seeing what works, I guess, even if you don't exactly know what it's doing. But I do find it helpful. Blending and balance are quite good. As far as I can remember, I'm not sure what blending does actually, but balance I think is like this the sort of a shift between all of these three. So in the middle, they're fairly even, and your midtones are gonna sort of be there. But if you shift over to that, you're kind of skewing things to the shadow color, and then if you skew it more to the highlights color. And of course, like going back and forth between these, you'll end up with similar results. I think I played around originally with a bit of noise. You won't see on this because it'll end up getting compressed. But where are my effects? Where are my effects? Okay. I think I probably played around with some noise, some sort of grainy film noise, but I knew these were going to end up quite small and get compressed on like Instagram and various stuff. And also, it was a fairly high ISO, so there was grain anyway. So I think I didn't mess around with that. Although a vignette, chuck a vignette on, why not? Whether you do it here or whether you do it as a sort of masking thing, it's always worth doing. To that, actually, it didn't on this, but it's one of the sort of techniques I've started using kind of more. Is masking like specifically people, and the auto stuff is really good, but for this sort of filming, like you don't really need to do it. And it's just a case of like, let's just brighten up sort of some of the bits of the image that you might want to sort of pay more attention to, sort of brighter slash more detailed images. So let's just see what happens. So we're going to like slightly increase exposure, but really what we're going to do is we're going to actually finally use that clarity, and that will give us that kind of bit of crunch in those bits that we've highlighted. The dehaze works quite well there as well. Texture, for those that aren't fully aware, the contrast is sort of like a global contrast, I guess. And then these are also contrast, but texture is, oops, let's just go out of here. Texture is, actually, let's show on here, let's zoom in. So texture will be like micro details. So that'll bring out things like grain or, I don't know, like detailed things on someone's face, like stubble, whatever. Clarity is sort of somewhere in between. It's like it's details, but not like minute details. It's like sort of localized contrast. So you'll see it. It has a fairly extreme effect actually, and I really don't like that look generally. And then dehaze is sort of much wider. It's like sort of big details. That's why it's quite good for things like skies and clouds and things like that. Um, yeah, anyway, where was I? I was messing around with masks, wasn't I? So yeah, we've got this mask. So yeah, we're just sort of brightening and adding a little bit of sort of localized contrast to some of those areas, which just makes them stand out a little bit more. Let's give it a bit more texture. Again, this isn't something I did before actually, but it's something I started to do a lot more on portraits, especially like people's features, like adding sort of layers and layers and layers of clarity and texture for certain features like eyes or like the face, and then more clarity for the eyes and more clarity for the pupils and sclera and essentially things like that. All right, where are we at? So I don't know. That's looking pretty good. I think that's actually better than the original one. The original one looks relatively flat, whereas that's a bit more shiny. So yeah, that's kind of what I did. There's probably more that I've forgotten, but I'll do for now.